Last week I said that each of America's big three bombers had something they wouldn't die to, with the B-52 spitting in the face of age and the B-1 refusing to give in to bureaucracy. But the B-2's worst nightmare is not enemy fire, nor is it people forgetting it's not a German concept. It's the military-industrial complex, because they bungled the building of it so bad that it's a miracle we got to keep any of them. Today we're going to talk about the newest of America's big three bombers, the B-2 Spirit. We talked about the buff and we talked about the bone, now it's time for the boomerang. This is the first true stealth bomber in the world, and the floating Dorito of doom might not have the biggest payload, be the fastest to fling, or the cheapest to keep, but that's because it's the only one made to play now you see me, now you don't with entire countries.
I see you.
No, you don't.
And to make doubly sure that the B-2 could do that, the Air Force changed its requirements just before awarding the contract, which would have been fine if there were any company other than Northrop at the wheel of the program, because they were knee-deep in some of the most avoidable mismanagement scandals on the planet, one of which almost turned the B-2 into a Spirit. And speaking of ghosts, before unveiling the B-2's timeline, I have to bust a myth that still haunts Uncle Sam's stealth bomber program to this day. And that myth is spread around by a bunch of people running around on the internet claiming something to the effect of, "Bah, the Americans only got the B-2 Spirit because of the Horton HR-229, the first stealth aircraft ever." Some of these people have just not done their research, but others are these punks colloquially known on the internet as wearaboos for their concerningly fanatical support, sometimes in ignorance of clear evidence, of Wehrmacht military tech and tactics from World War II Germany, aka
the fucking
And the fact that censoring the party name took priority over the curse word should tell you everything you need to know about the internet today. Just because you don't have the parrot to look history in the eyes doesn't give you the right to remove some of the means of reminding people why this should never happen again. And one of the things that came from that empire in history that better not happen again was a prototype aircraft known as the Horton HO-229. This was planned to be a jet-propelled flying wing interceptor, but the Allies were too busy kicking the Germans' teeth in for it to get anywhere. By the end of the war, America had seized the center bodies of the last four prototypes under Operation Lusty, and those were shoved into boxes, shipped back to the United States, studied, and then left alone until the V-3 prototype eventually got put up for show at the Stephen F. Udvar-Hazy Center in Northern Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. And these wearaboos believe the flying Who from not Whoville has two main claims to fame. One, it was the first stealth aircraft, and two, America got the idea for the B-2's flying wing design from it. Both of these are bullshit, and we'll take them one by one.
You're saying
Yes.
Let's talk about
Starting with the stealth. In 1983, one of the aircraft's two lead designers, Raymar Horton, published a co-authored book called Nerflugel describing their process of pursuing the Horton 229's design. And in that book, Horton claimed that he and his brother planned to incorporate charcoal into the plywood skin of the aircraft to absorb incoming radar energy and make the plane invisible to radar. Why did he wait almost 40 years to talk about having the first stealth plane? Well, if I had to guess, it probably had something to do with him being on the losing team and needed to wait for the younger generations to not remember all the genocides his team did so people would trust what he was saying at face value.
just in case you accidentally wander into a voting booth one day, there's some things you should know, and one of them is
It seems awfully weird to me that this foray into radar-absorbent materials was conveniently never mentioned to the American intelligence teams that brought him stateside as part of Project Paperclip along with their designs, only to bring it up 2 years after Reagan announced the US would develop a stealth bomber. I mean, who is he going to keep it secret for, the Soviets? And there's no shortage of much more obvious counter-arguments that the HO-229 wouldn't have been stealth either. The engines are way too exposed, the cannons are poking out, and the canopy glass would have to be infused with different materials like indium tin oxide to reduce its radar signature. Now, the Horton brothers claim that they came up with this plywood and charcoal design at their own inspiration, aka they made it up. But after just trying to figure out how RAM works with modern science and reports and what kind of stuff has to be used for it, you could not convince me that even Einstein himself could just pull the material science of radar stealth out of his rectum. Sure, Walter Horton learned about the effectiveness of radar while he was the tech officer for one of the Luftwaffe units in the Battle of Britain, because most semi-intelligent people notice if there's a reason they're getting their can tan 30 shades of purple, but with the sheer volume of radar studies and experimentation going on in Germany since before World War II, there's no way that was the only place they got their knowledge. Radar and radar countermeasures were way more in use in World War II than most people realize, especially after the Brits started using it to spin pinwheel heads in the Battle of Britain. Britain. The carrots improving your night vision story didn't keep the secret from Germany forever, and radar is basically also the entire reason that German fighters were able to find the American bomber streams every time they came in with how much territory they were guarding. On top of that, the No Nuts Party had one hell of a time finding the British de Havilland Mosquito on radar. There's a lot of forum conversations and scant details debated about how the Mosquito pulled that off, but the details available are very simplified and not very consistent, so historical accounts and conversations might not be the best thing to go off of. But if there's one thing that is much harder to question, that's science.
Yes, science!
And when digging into research papers on radar-absorptive materials, one of the things I found out was that several different chemical compounds with radar-absorbent properties are made up almost entirely of the element known as carbon. For those of you who might need a chemistry refresher, not only is carbon one of the lightest elements on the periodic table, it is also one of, if not the most, versatile of all known elements. Most elements can only have a positive or negative charge if they are turned into ions, but carbon can have both. And on top of that, it can also form chemical compounds that don't rely on ionizing at all. And when carbon forms a compound that can't make up its electrical mind, it is terrible at conducting the electromagnetic energy that radar relies on to detect things. And the Mosquito was made of a carbon-based material called wood, which at least theoretically gives it a boost against radar. But wood also has other elements in it, and it's definitely not pure carbon. If anything, the wooden wonders not being picked up on radar probably had more to do with the weaker strength of early search radars and how far away they were. In fact, the only radar-equipped anything that could get a solid beat on the Mosquito were a handful of German night fighters, and that probably only worked because even in today's world, there's a major difference between picking up a sneaky aircraft with radar stations tens of miles away and doing it with a radar that's pretty much already up your ass.
I'm watching you, Wazowski.
When the No Nuts Party finally did give up on trying to beat the Mosquito in combat, they ended up just building their own, the Ta-154 Mosquito with a K, which was primarily made of wood and had a similar radar benefit. So what I'm guessing the Horton brothers probably did was they saw all of the efforts that Germany had made towards radar countermeasures, then looked at wooden planes, which were somehow borderline invisible to that, and said, wood is good, is it possible to change its state to make it better? So they took wood, they did a bunch of stuff to it, then they ran some quick radar tests and said, charcoal is good, throw it in. Bada bing, bada boom, they had primitive RAM. With primitive being the operative word, because I'm not sure if the charcoal would have made any noticeable difference. First off, the only carbon-based radar-absorbent material that I could find that results from nearly exclusively burning things is carbon black, which is pure elemental carbon that results from the unfinished burning of mixtures of oils and gases. However, the ideal production of this requires a carefully controlled process, which isn't all that possible when you have cities getting bombed out from under your feet. But if you burn wood, which has natural oils in it, and turn that into charcoal, it is not impossible to create charcoal with trace amounts of carbon black, which could contribute to a reduced radar return during any sample materials testing and give engineers the idea that charcoal could reduce radar signature.
Fire, 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 fire! Rock!
Now, this whole conversation would be a lot easier if we could get our hands on this supposed material and test it, and luckily for us, the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum is way ahead of us. One of their restoration labs managed to extract some samples of the plywood construction that appeared to have some of the charcoal components in the mixture, specifically within the adhesive layers of the plywood. After chemically and physically isolating microscopic chunks of these black materials, they hit them with a bunch of tests to try and figure out what they were. But so far, they're only able to speculate that the plywood layers had aged so badly they somehow changed color. But in the plywood, there was one defining detail that stood out to them. If charcoal was such a critical component of their stealth, why were the adhesive layers the charcoal would be stuck into so thin? Now, my best guess at that is that they never got far enough to stick the charcoal in the plywood in the first place, if they were even going to do it. But just going by the volume of modern scientific knowledge, the entire idea that something as unrefined as charcoal could provide any noticeable stealth benefit over just wood was probably more of a German panic moment at the time than a discovery of actual scientific value. The 229 may have been the first deliberate attempt at making a stealthy plane, but attempting and achieving are two very different things. I mean, the Soviets attempted to get a man on the moon before we did, but they didn't achieve it, now did they?
Checkmate, bitch.
And by the results we're seeing, the HO-229 probably wouldn't have achieved any more stealth, if any, than what the Mosquito already had. So first stealth aircraft? Definitely not German. If it wasn't British, it was American, but definitely not German.
Enough?
But there's still that second Wehraboo claim to fame, which is that America pulled the B-2's flying wing design from the HO-229. They didn't do that either, and now we can start telling the story of where the B-2 came from. And that homestead was the dreams of Northrop's lead engineer, John Knudsen Jack Northrop.
Jack was out!
Jack had been interested in the idea of a flying wing, which he called the perfect airplane, since he and factory manager Anthony Stadelman first imagined it in the mid-1920s while working for a company called Lockheed. Yeah, this guy worked for Lockheed before it was spelled Lockheed. A flying wing aircraft wouldn't have any of the aerodynamic drag force caused by separate tail surfaces or intersections with the fuselage, and it also wouldn't have their weight. Removing everything but the wing would make the entire airplane far more efficient, thus making the aircraft structure also a lot more efficient. However, Northrop wouldn't be able to start pursuing this design until after he established Northrop Aviation in August 1939, when he would start by making the N1M, standing for Northrop First Model. Wasn't ideal, wasn't powerful enough, but it worked, and it flew for the first time on July 3rd, 1940. So he took his notes, fixed the problems, and went back to the drawing board for the next plane, and by September 1941, he had drawn up and submitted preliminary designs for his next flying wing, the XB-35. This was made to be a massive bomber with 4 3,000 horsepower engines, each driving a pair of counter-rotating propellers. The Army Air Corps didn't feel like they were going to need them for World War II, but they were interested in the design's potential, so they would give Northrop a contract for 2 prototypes. The XB-35 wouldn't take flight until June 25, 1946, after the war ended, but after updating it to the YB-35 improved prototype in late 1947, the now Air Force requested that Northrop update the plane yet again for the jet age, to which he responded by ripping the 4 prop engines out and giving the bomber 8 jet engines.
That's a lot of power.
The propellers had provided gyroscopic torque stability for the aircraft, and the spread-out disc area had actually also provided yaw stability by way of thrust-reactive control. But without the propellers, all that was gone, and so the YB-49 also got some extra vertical strakes and tail fins on it to compensate. But that wouldn't fix all the stability issues of the flying wing design, and without an advanced control system, it was basically a flying time bomb. And that's what the Air Force told him when they ordered Northrop to terminate his work on the B-49 on January 11, 1949, although the real reason was because of President Truman's cuts to the 1950 defense budget causing multiple aircraft program cancellations. He was still allowed to continue working on the RB-49 recon version, but only for the purpose of testing recon equipment. And by November, the government had canned any plans to convert the YB-35s to YB-49s, basically shutting down any chance he thought his dreams had. Northrop would testify before Congress that he was under no pressure in the wake of this decision, but he would be insanely bitter over it and resign in 1952.
You know how much I sacrificed?
He would also later try to take back his testimony in 1980, saying that the Air Force had sabotaged his program after he refused to merge with Convair. For the most part, this claim would go unanswered, but lucky for him, it wouldn't need to be. Backtrack real quick to June 30th, 1977. The B-1A Lancer has just been canceled for cost reasons by the Carter administration and Secretary of Defense Harold Brown. The Department of Defense, knowing that they still needed a new penetrating bomber to replace the still aging B-52, got behind the R&D wheel and started driving at developing yet another bomber study. And since newer air defenses had made no amount of speed fast enough, they decided to rely on magic.
Can't shoot what you can't see.
So stealth it was, and after Northrop, now just the company, showed enough interest in the project to commit to a low observable technology study in mid-1979, the U.S. Air Force initiated the Advanced Strategic Penetrating Aircraft, or APSA program, to formally start the new bomber process on their end in January 1980. Northrop would receive a concept study and demonstration contract as part of this, giving them the funding to start developing the model of their bomber, in the shape of a flying wing. If only the founder could see it. Oh wait. By April of 1980, not only had Northrop finished making their model of the APSA bomber, but they were able to push through all the paperwork and clearances to get Jack Northrop to come back and visit his old company to see the bomber design. And upon seeing the flying wing model they intended to present, all of his bitterness, all of his resentment, everything just faded away. And he said, "Now I know why God kept me alive for 25 more years."
It's enough to make a grown man cry.
By mid-1980, Northrop had made enough progress to go right ahead and send out the request for proposals to the now renamed Advanced Technology Bomber, or ATB program. to which Northrop and Lockheed responded. After this was kicked off, Secretary of Defense Harold Brown would first announce the existence of the new stealth bomber program, probably in response to Reagan's campaign criticism, and work would continue into the next year. And early in that next year, on February 18, 1981, Jack Northrop would pass away, leaving the rest of his life's work in his company's hands.
It's up to you, Kakarot. Don't you fail too.
And the first thing Northrop did was drop the ball, because apparently the minute their founder left the server, so did the company's brain cells.
And the launch was a disaster.
Somewhere around the same time as Jack Northrop's passing, the Air Force changed their requirements for the bomber to be both high and low altitude capable, so it could adapt its tactics to different enemy air defense systems. Dealing with the denser air at low altitudes forced Northrop to redesign the airframe, and as a result, they had to change the original W-shaped trailing edge for a more jagged trailing edge. This then required them to add more internal structures and control surfaces and started delaying the schedule. Now, normally this would be the Air Force's fault, but Northrop, for whatever reason, decided not to update their production schedule. But there are no immediate consequences and the program just keeps going. By the summer of 1981, the requirements for the ATB contract had been fully fleshed out, and within the next 2 months or so, Northrop's design, codenamed Senior Ice, would beat out Lockheed's F-117 with a dad bod codenamed Senior Peg. So Northrop gets the full-scale development contract for the ATB program, and the Air Force orders 133 planes, 6 test units, and 127 production bombers. On October 2nd, President Reagan announced his strategic modernization program, which will fund a stealth bomber as part of his 2-bomber program, and the rest of 1981 passes without incident.
Nothing to see here.
The years would continue, with the public getting a bit more info about the stealth bomber in 1986, the ATB being named the B-2 Spirit in 1987, and then on November 22nd, 1988, the B-2 would go on public display for the first time when it was rolled out of its hangar at Air Force Plant 42 in Palmdale, California. The program's contractors would also be announced, those being Northrop, Boeing, and Vought. Yeah, Vought is still around. You know, the guys who built the F-4U Corsair and the F-8 Crusader before merging with a bunch of other companies in the 60s? Those guys. But the B-2's flying wing would finally take flight for the first time on July 17th, 1989. And 4 months later, the Berlin Wall fell.
Are you f***ing kidding me?
And within a few months, that other hammer Northrop was ignoring also fell. In February 1990, the Government Accounting Office would release a report on the program to Congress. See, the B-2 Spirit was the most costly defense program in U.S. history up to that time, and in America, cost plus secrecy equals a lot of smack talk, which Congress, as usual, is all too happy to oblige. Classification updates downshifted the secrecy of the program, and Congress immediately took the initiative to order the GAO to review the B-2 program. And as much as I'd like to rag on Congress for ruining nice things yet again, the inner workings of the program had pretty much done that for them. Because it turns out this wasn't the first review of the program, it was just the first unclassified report. In fact, the data presented in that report was just declassified data they had already written into the 5 classified reports made in the last 4 years at the request of the chairman of the House Committee on Armed Services in 1986. 2 of the big ones came after January 1986, when they started manufacturing the first prototype, and June 1989, when the first development aircraft was delivered. According to the Air Force, the cost of the B-2 program to develop and buy 133 planes in 1981 dollars was going to be $32.7 billion. But by January 1986, that cost had grown to $36.6 billion in 1981 dollars. By 1998, the program then required a total of a 3-year schedule extension, with the last B-2 planned for delivery in mid-1999. This additional time had grown the program cost to a 1981 total of $42.1 billion, triggering a congressional request for the Air Force to make a B-2 savings plan and the Secretary of Defense refusing to approve it. By June 1989, the Air Force had created a savings plan that would take the program cost down, but the schedule extensions made things so uncertain that instead of cutting 10% of the cost, they were only able to manage dropping it by $6.2 billion in 1981 dollars. But even with those savings, the cost still went up, resulting in the Secretary of Defense approving a new estimate of $43.8 billion in 1981 dollars. And that that 1989 estimate was still considered optimistic, as it assumed that annual funding in the early 90s would be roughly 60% more than they had gotten every year before that, and the House Committee on Armed Services had already stated they would never approve anything close to the totals they would need. So where did all these cost increases come from? You'll never guess, but this is all the same butterfly effect of not updating the delivery schedule across the board when they had to redesign the bomber.
Surprise!
As a result of the changes to the bomber design pushing back the design schedule, in January 1986, the manufacturers started building the planes before they had actually finished making them. They had planned to do this in the beginning, and if the design had been the same as before, it wouldn't have mattered. But the design change, coupled with the out-of-date schedule, made things so much worse. And somewhere else along the line, they also switched from making the airframe out of aluminum to making it out of more expensive and difficult to work on composites. This caused drawings to be rewritten and delayed, leaving factory managers without the right blueprints and tools, or sometimes even the wrong ones, and backing up the whole production traffic jam even further. While the production schedule somehow couldn't be updated before January 1986, after that it couldn't sit still. At least one change would be made every single year, and over the course of the 3.5 years from the January 1986 report to the January 1989 report, the production timeline had shifted from ordering all 127 of the production aircraft and having 52 of them in hand by 1993 to having only 47 ordered and 9 in hand. Most of the development and delivery milestones had also shifted by almost 2 years, and the Air Force wasn't expecting to have 15 bombers in hand, called the required assets milestone, until over 3 years later than expected. I'm pretty sure that at that point, the only reason the program was even continued was because making sure everybody didn't die in a nuclear hellscape is pretty worth the cost. This whole festival of fuckery got to the point that Northrop tried to address it by seeking Air Force approval to centralize manufacturing work and take it from their subcontractors to try and hurry it up. Despite this, the first development aircraft was still delivered 19 months late, and while the amount of man-hours of labor transferred to Northrop's final assembly site was supposed to decrease after the first 2 units, it wasn't doing that nearly as much as it should have. By June 1989, the Air Force had also added 2 more aircraft to low-rate production and delayed full-rate production to 1991. The Secretary of Defense had approved a 1-year delay for flight testing from 1988 to 1989, but it basically didn't change any of the already overlapping timelines, and production avionics and radar units had to be approved for manufacturing before the test units were even delivered.
That's not good.
But the thing that was really obscene was the number of defects. Defects are defined as flaws that would require additional work to correct them or replace the part they're on. And by 1988, the Air Force was expecting the first 2 aircraft to have about 160,000 defects, which is a really large number, but the Air Force was expecting factory crews to have a tough time with these new planes. They predicted the majority of those defects would come from badly drilled holes and Boeing having issues with sealing the fuel tanks, and that the number of defects would decrease with each successive model. In reality, the first 2 planes had 190,000 defects, and while Northrop expected they would have that down to 60,000 by test model number 6, at the time the rate of defects was not only not decreasing for the next 4 planes, it was also higher than what it had been for both of the first 2. And all of that was because Northrop tried to centralize the work to try and meet deadlines. The Air Force was sure this wouldn't affect the production models, but it's still absolutely ridiculous that this even happened. And the fact that the Cold War had ended just after all this was just the cherry on top of this cake supreme. And Congress found out about all of that at the same time.
Oh, no.
Naturally, they hopped into that mosh pit like frat boys trying to get laid and put a ton of back pressure on the administration, forcing Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney to cut the total number of B-2s ordered from 133 to 75. This cut the B-2 program cost from $74.5 billion to $61.1 billion. But because of how scale works, it also raised the per unit cost from $571 million to $815 million. But congressional pressure on the program would continue, and on January 28, 1992, President Bush reluctantly announced that the B-2's production would end at 20 units. This cut the program total cost to only $44.4 billion, but as a result gives any critical media outlet the ability to mistype the bomber as being worth more than $2 billion apiece, which is about 2.5 times its actual acquisition cost. A 21st would be allowed on March 21st, 1996, when the Clinton administration authorized the Air Force to upgrade their last B-2 prototype to the latest production standard for $493 million. This was approved by the Air Force in May, away, and while all that was happening, the first production B-2, the Spirit of Missouri, was delivered on December 17, 1993. By 1997, the B-2 Spirit had reached initial operating capability, and from there, it was finally off to the races. Not that you'd notice, though, because the B-2 could sneak past a beholder in plain sight in broad daylight. It makes next to no noise, and the engine outlet at least appears to use the same trick as the F-117, funneling the exhaust gases through a slimmer outlet over a platypus tail to quickly mix it with ambient air to cool down, all the while shielding it from heat sensors at lower altitudes. And since the engines are buried into the wings, the intakes can be a lot more limiting at low speeds, requiring the set of intake doors on the top that you see open when it's on the ground. These sneaky features mean that the four General Electric F-118 non-afterburning turbofans putting out 17,300 pounds of thrust each can push the B-2 to high subsonic speeds that are unspecified, but if I had to guess, Mach 0.8-ish, and go right over your head without making a sound and being barely thermally visible. And those aren't even the main event, that's the radar stealth. The flying wing shape relies on split rudder flaps at the wingtips for yaw control, which fold out and act as air brakes on one side or the other. It also uses 3 sets of elevons, or surfaces that double as elevators and ailerons for pitch and roll, plus a flap on the center for countering the bending loads caused by wind gusts, called a gust load alleviation system, or GLASS, which is the same thing the knot canards do on the B-1. All this gets hooked up to a fly-by-wire control system, which finally solves the stability problems the XB-35 and the YB-49 had, and completely gets rid of any and all vertical fins. Not only does that reduce drag, but it's also one less thing for radar to bounce off of, making the flying wing arguably one of the stealthiest airframe shapes imaginable. Throw in the composite construction, the radar absorbent materials, and the planform alignment putting all the edges at the same angles, and you get something so silent but deadly it makes chemical weapons look obvious.
I'm going for a walk.
No, you don't.
This 160,000 pound or 72,500 knot pound legally distinct batarang can take off weighing a max of up to 336,500 pounds or over 152,500 knot pounds, with almost half of that weight in gas inside of 8 internal tanks. While this does mean it will drink most of the KC-135's 200,000 pound flying gas tank, this also makes the B-2 the only one of America's big 3 bombers to have a max takeoff weight under 400,000 pounds and carry less gas than the tanker. Without refueling, the B-2 can fly 6,000 miles. With one refueling, Uncle Sam's sneaky boomerang can come back around the entire planet and have some fumes left over to get high off of.
Let's get high.
But if it's feeling low, the crew of 2 can fly their Spirit down low with the terrain-following capabilities in their AESA radar. But if you're looking to erase some terrain features, for a little while that depended on the version, or the block. There were 3 blocks, 10, 20, and 30, and 0 if that's what you want to call the 6 test units. Block 10s could only carry 16 unguided 2,000-pound bombs or free-fall nukes on the same rotary launchers the B-1 used. 10 were built to this standard, and 4 were upgraded to the Block 20 standard in 1996 and 1997. The Block 20 standard was also what the next 3 were built to, and those could carry the GPS-aided munition, or GAM, 2,000-pound JDAMs, up to 36 cluster bombs, and have both partial low-level terrain following and a mission planning suite. You know, just in case someone wakes up and decides they're in desperate need of a warhead to the forehead. But the Block 30s were the spirits with the full kit. Block 30 B-2s can carry JSOWs, up to 8,500-pound bombs or sea mines, or 37 firebombs, and came with satellite comms, twice the radar modes, fully functional terrain following, mission planning, and electronic defense suites, along with a contrail management system. But in July 1995, it was decided to upgrade all units except for that last test model to the Block 30 standard. The first Block 30 unit produced was delivered on August 7, 1997, and by July 14, 2000, all B-2s in service were Block 30s. And the Block 30's total payload capacity is most commonly listed at 40,000 pounds or 50,000 pounds depending on your source. But anybody who can do basic math knows it's actually 60,000 pounds or just over 18,000 knot pounds. And that's because of the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP, which is a 30,000-pound GPS-guided bomb that can park itself within a foot of a traffic cone before cleaning out your bunker from under a mountain. The B-2 is the only plane that can carry this bomb, which was introduced in 2011, and it can pack up to 2 of these for next day shipping you to God, which is exactly what they would start doing to people in 1999. In 1999, the bomb-slinging Boomerang would finally take to combat skies over Serbia for Operation Allied Force, flying non-stop from Missouri to Kosovo and back, dropping 600 JDAMs in their debut and blowing up 33% of all Serbian targets in the first 8 weeks. It would sit tight for 2 more years until 9/11, when somebody who clearly hadn't studied Pearl Harbor thought swinging at America on its home turf was a good idea. Uncle Sam would respond with a lot of freedom, specifically Operation Enduring Freedom, where the B-2 would fly one of its longest missions to date from Whiteman Air Force Base to Afghanistan and back. Somewhere during that year, Grumman also sent the Air Force an offer to build 40 more B-2s at a discounted $735 million apiece, to squeeze a little more value out of their work. But Congress was holding that grudge like an axe, and they were still upset at that 1990 report, and consequently refused again. Which is kind of ironic because now the Air Force has a congressionally mandated minimum bomber force and has to use a bunch of older bombers to keep it, but that's neither here nor there. B-2s would finally deploy to a combat theater for the first time instead of just fighting from home during Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003. Death needed to be put on speed dial, and so the B-2 would drop 1.5 million pounds of ordnance across 49 sorties flown from both the forward base and Whiteman Air Force Base.
This fight was cute and all, but it's time to die!
Now, during this conflict, the B-2 still wasn't meeting its full potential. It wasn't after September 10, 2003 that the B-2 was finally qualified to carry all 80 500-pound JDAMs after 11 test flights, which is so many bombs that Major General Jason Armagost, a crew member during a follow-on practice run over Utah testing range the following year, claimed that the bomber he was on ran out of practice targets to blow up, and so they did the next best Air Force thing and bombed a smiley face into one of the mock runways on the range.
Hey buddy, turn that frown upside down. Okay.
It would continue to help out with major American operations like Odyssey Dawn and now recently Operation Midnight Hammer in June of 2025. And Midnight Hammer is arguably one of the most brilliant ways of using stealth that I've ever seen. During Midnight Hammer, America sent 2 B-2 Spirits from the US over the Pacific to the base in Guam with their transponders on. So not stealthy, not hiding, no nothing. Now, some people would look at that and say, oh, America sent some bombers over to Guam, big whoop. But that's not what happened. Everybody was all over that. Heck, there was somebody who came into my Twitch chat because I was streaming that day and asked me, hey Cap, America just sent B-2s to Guam, why would they do that? And I said something smart like, I don't know, and went back to whatever set of pixels I was trying to blow up at the time. The thing is, I didn't realize this was the B-2 Spirit we were talking about. America had less than 20 of these in active service and outside of the repair bay at that time, and Uncle Sam doesn't send his sneaky Doritos anywhere unless he's trying to send a message. And the fact that he had sent only 2 of them and that the DoD hadn't said anything yet implied that it was going to be something important. So everybody was watching these B-2s and waiting, meaning that nobody was looking for the 7 other B-2s that flew around the planet from the other direction, undetected with their transponders off, and dropped the first 14 MOPs used in combat on Iranian underground nuclear production sites.
You didn't see that coming?
This is brilliant, okay? How do you trick people into not seeing the stealth bombers coming your way? Easy, you deliberately let them see the other ones they don't need to worry about. This operation was a masterclass in the fusion between propaganda and military capability, because for all the show that can be modern media, Uncle Sam isn't just letting it run its mouth. He's learning how to use it. The Air Force or the Pentagon or whoever planned this had to have known that the B-2 going anywhere was going to be a high-profile event, and even a stealth aircraft can be shot down if people are at least looking in the right direction. So they weaponized the B-2's news value to draw attention away from the direction of attack. These guys have just been outclassed on one of the most incomprehensible levels possible. Not only is it a defense budget flex that we had enough stealth bombers to use some of them as decoys, but it's the bomber equivalent of seeing a group of frat boys starting to cause some young ladies at the bar some problems if 2 of your buddies hit them with their taunts while you and the rest of the homies charge up from behind and dogpile them.
Nothing. I just want you to face me so she could get behind you.
But for all the B-2's power, it is still an aging program, and because of the intricacies of its tech, that might hurt it more than its peers. The stealth coating needs a small national defense budget to maintain it every year, and climate-controlled hangars are a must to slow the aging down. They're also not immune to just random issues. Being named the Spirit apparently opens the gate for more than one superstition, with the second B-2 having so much go wrong it got nicknamed Murphy's Law and the Ship from Hell, and the crews for the 4th one thinking it was possessed and for some reason giving it the nickname seem pristine. At least one has been lost to a crash, and 2 other severely damaging crashes happened in recent years that grounded the fleet until May 2023. But that hasn't stopped it from being updated. In December 2021, a B-2 completed its first successful test launch of a JASSM-ER stealth cruise missile, and by July 2022, Grumman delivered the Radar-Aided Targeting System, or RATS, promised by its 2014 modernization contract, which is designed to make any nukes more accurate and thus more worthy of pants. The Air Force plans to retire the B-2s when enough B-21s are fielded, which the Air Force expects is going to be around 2032. Which means, according to current timelines and the ironic hand of fate, that the newest of America's big 3 is going to be the first out the door. But it hasn't left yet, so enemies beware. The B-2 can still take your country to church if fight America you so dare. Thank you for watching. We got merch and other links in the description, and if you like what you saw, please consider checking out some of my other videos. You might like what you find. Until next time, dismissed.